What we have seen over the last several weeks is that Genesis, the book of Genesis, does not tell the story of good people who do great things. That's typically the way it's read. We look at Genesis as a catalog of moral heroes that we're supposed to emulate. If you've been in church for a long period of time, if you've been in church for any period of time, if you grew up in Sunday school, that's probably the way the book of Genesis was handled. Abraham and Noah and Isaac and all of these people were held up before you as heroes to emulate. And what we've discovered as we've made our way through this very familiar book and through these very familiar stories is that Genesis does not tell the story of good people who do great things. It tells the story of great sin, which is met with an even greater grace. That's what we've seen. We've seen that with Adam, we've seen that with Eve, we've seen that with Cain, we've seen that with Noah, and we've even seen that with Abraham. I mean, think about it. The cosmic rebellion of Adam and Eve is met with the promise of a Savior. The deserved death of Cain is met with the promise that God would protect his life. None of this makes sense. Noah went from being among the wicked to walking with God after God had given him favor. The Bible makes it very clear there that Noah was counted among the wicked, counted among the unrighteous, and then God sovereignly distributes favor and grace to Noah, and it's only after God favors him and gives him grace, undeserved favor, that Noah begins to walk with God. And then I mentioned a couple weeks ago, after telling Noah that people would get worse after the flood, God promised that he would never again destroy the earth. And I said, how counterintuitive that is. That doesn't make sense. I mean, God says, even though people are going to get worse, I will never again destroy the earth with a flood. I mean, you would think that God would say, okay, I think they've learned their lesson. I've just destroyed the entire earth with water. From this point forward, people are going to take me seriously. They're going to walk the straight and narrow, and they're never going to mess up again. That's not what he says. He says, things are going to get worse than they were before. And yet I'm promising never to destroy the earth with a flood again. And then we saw a couple weeks ago that Abraham's paganness is met with God's unconditional promise to bless the world through him. It's amazing. Abraham, like Noah, was counted among the unrighteous. He was living amongst a pagan people, a non-believing people. And yet God points him out, God selects him, and God not only calls him unconditionally, he doesn't say, hey, listen, I have a plan for you, and if you can just do X, Y, and Z, then I will execute that plan through you. He doesn't do that. He calls him unconditionally, and then he makes an unconditional promise to him that through him, he was going to bless the world. Okay, this is the gospel according to Genesis. We see it over and over and over again throughout all of these familiar stories, and all of these familiar stories are telling us something about who we are as sinners, who God is as a Savior, and all of these stories are whetting our appetite, getting us ready for the one hero that the Bible presents, namely Jesus. And so here again, we see that what Jesus said in Luke 24 to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, that all of the Old Testament speaks of me, all of the Old Testament highlights me, all of the Old Testament points to me. The Bible is a Jesus-centered book. It tells one story and it points to one figure, and we've seen that over and over and over again, that God gives his best when we are at our worst. Okay? And we see that throughout Genesis. We see that supremely in who Jesus is and what he came to do for sinners. The New Testament says it this way, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That verse summarizes everything we've been learning so far, that God meets great sin with an even greater grace, that while we were yet sinners, God came. that in our sin, God comes, that where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. But as you and I know, not only is this the story of all of the characters that we read about in Genesis, but it's our story too. That God meets our rebellion with his rescue. That God meets our sin with his salvation. That God meets our guilt with his grace. That God meets our badness with his goodness. That's who he is. That's the good news. That's what grace is all about. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it this way, so good. In the very place where we have fallen away from God, where we have become dead and unreceptive to him, it is there that God's love searches us out. I mean, that's the gospel. That's the good news. While we were yet sinners, God came. While we were running, God came. That while we were choosing to be our own God, the hound of heaven tracked us down and magnificently defeated us. That's the good news. God doesn't come, and Jesus said this specifically, I have not come to save the righteous. I've come for the unrighteous. I have not come for the healthy. I've come for the sick. And his point was not that there are, righteous people and unrighteous people. These people don't need Jesus and these people do. It's not that he was saying there are sick people and healthy people. These people need me and these people don't. What he was saying is that there are people who understand that they're unrighteous and there are people who don't. There are people who are aware of their sickness and there are people who have deceived themselves into thinking that they're healthy. Well, it's the sick people. It's the people who are aware of how unrighteous they are, how needy they are, how desperate they are, that I have come to save. Well, in this story, the story of the promise of Isaac's birth, is the ultimate story of the way God meets us. He meets us in our death with the gift of life. That's what this story tells us. That's what this story is all about. It's about God meeting us in our death and gifting us with life. If you look at Genesis 17, verses 15 and 16, the promise from God is abundantly clear here. God makes it very clear that he will give a son to Abraham and Sarah, and from this child will become a great nation. And in verse 17, we get Abraham's response to this. Okay, God comes and says, I'm going to give you a son, and from this son, I will make a great nation that will bless the whole world. Abraham's 100. His wife Sarah is 90. And barren, and Abraham laughs, okay? Understandably so. He laughs. Verse 17 says, Abraham fell on his face and laughed. I'm 100, she's 90, she's barren. How can we possibly have a son? This is humanly impossible, okay? I mean, he literally says, okay, whatever, I mean, possibly if this was your plan, God, you could have gifted us with a son in our prime, I'm 25, she's 15. That sounds a little gross, so, but there is a 10-year difference here. I'm 45, she's 35, all right? I mean, he's thinking, why did you wait so long? I'm 100, she's 90, she's barren, her womb is dead. And now you come and promise that we're going to have a son. And not only are we going to have a son, but we're going to have a son. And out of that son, you're going to make a great nation. And then you're going to bless the whole world. Come on, God. I mean, I know you're big and everything, but come on. This is ridiculous. And so he laughs, understandably so. In the face of human impossibility, Abraham laughs. Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Romans 4, actually intensifies Abraham and Sarah's condition. And he says, because they're old and barren, they're described as dead. Okay? that they're dead. The ESV translates this as barren, but the Greek word literally means death or deadness. And the point is that the body of Abraham and the womb of Sarah are lifeless. 190 barren. Okay, so the hope for biological life coming from these two people is impossible. It can't happen. Paul says they were dead. They were as good as dead in the sense that they could not produce an heir. But it's always the impossible that God promises. It's what he does, okay? He promises life where there is only death. And in response to Abraham's laughter and unbelief, God restates this impossible promise. God gives this promise. Abraham laughs. Unbelief. You know, how many times have I said that the root of all sin is unbelief? It's failing to believe that God is God and we are not. It's failing to believe that God can do what we can't do and that God has done for us what we could never do for ourselves. And so we take matters into our own hands. Well, in unbelief, Abraham laughs, and so God restates this impossible promise. And in verse 19, he says, Sarah will bear a son, and then get this, you will name him Isaac, which means laughter. As if God's gonna say, your laugh is going to come back and haunt you, okay? I mean, let me show you how my strength is showcased in your weakness. This is what I do, okay? God is saying. This is what I do. I don't create human beings and give them remarkable human potential and then wind them up and let them go. Paul said it very, very clearly. It is God's strength that is made manifest in our weakness. That's the reason God chooses the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. Because God doesn't leave any room for us to conclude, wow, he's great. That person's a big deal. God shows up and gives his best when we are at our weakest and our worst. And so God says, Sarah will bear a son, and you will name him Laughter, okay? You will give him the name Isaac. And then in chapter 21, this impossible promise becomes a reality. God acts. And in verses 1 and 2, it tells us that the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham. And then if you skip down in chapter 21 to verses 6 and 7, we read that Sarah laughed. Okay? God states this promise, and Abraham laughs. No way. Impossible. God says, she will bear a son, and you will name him Laughter. And then God makes good on this impossible promise. This impossible promise becomes a reality. Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and she laughs. She laughs because God did the impossible. God did what he said he would do. God's impossible promise, in other words, destroys faith in ourselves and delivers faith in God. Okay, that's what God's impossible promise does. Abraham laughs in unbelief. There's no way that this can happen. Sarah laughs in disbelief and says, I can't believe this happened. Okay, and in the middle of their two laughters, you have God telling them to name their son Laughter. We're going to look at what that means in a few minutes, but let me talk about this faith for a minute, because this is where this really touches ground in your life and mine. This is where this becomes really, really practical. Everything that I've said up until this point regarding Abraham, Sarah, God, that sort of thing, interesting, remarkably interesting, all true. But how does this touch ground in your life and in mine? Let me say this. Faith, real faith, okay, involves two confessions. The first confession of real faith is, I can't. All right? The second confession of real faith, the confession that follows the first confession, is God can. And what I mean by that is that God always works out of the opposite. Creating out of nothing, bringing life out of death, justifying the ungodly, as Paul says. And this forces us to face the fact that when it comes to the stuff that matters in life, the stuff that matters to you, the stuff that matters to me, we can't do it, okay? When it comes to the really important stuff, we can't do it. Abraham's laughter in chapter 17 shouts, "This is nonsense. Okay, I'm too old and she's barren. This can't happen." Now, what happens when we fail to believe God's promises? What happens when we fail to believe that God can do the impossible, can make possible what is humanly impossible? Well, we see it here. If you go back to chapter 16 in Genesis, Abraham and Sarah take matters into their own hands, and Sarah tells Abraham, "Go sleep with my handmaiden Hagar." Maybe this is the way God's gonna make good on this promise. I can't make sense of what God is doing. So maybe what he wants us to do is to take matters into our own hands, go to Hagar, my maid, my servant, sleep with her. Maybe God's going to give us a son through her. They take matters into their own hands. And what the impossible promise should do is make us say, I can't do it. I can't make it on my own. But you and I are very, very, very much like Abraham and Sarah. Okay, we encounter the impossible, and we therefore take matters into our own hands. This is Genesis chapter 3. All over again. I said that what we find in Genesis chapter 3 is Adam and Eve deciding to be their own God, deciding to take matters into their own hands so that they can generate their own worth and their own value and their own meaning and their own significance. Thank you so much, God, for bringing us into existence. We will take it from here. And the rest of the Bible is an outworking of how we as human beings are perpetually trying to be our own God by taking matters into our own hands. And here we see it again. Abraham and Sarah are on the receiving end of this impossible promise. They just can't believe it. It's crazy. It doesn't make sense. There's no way that this can happen, humanly speaking. And so they take matters into their own hands. And Abraham's wife says, "Go to Hagar and sleep with her, and she will bear you a son, since I can't do it." The stuff that really matters, life and love and peace and salvation, are not things that you and I can create. Okay, they're not things that you and I can generate. They're not things that you and I can work hard to accomplish. It's impossible, and yet we try to do it in a million different ways. In a million different ways, we try to create life and love and peace and salvation. The darkest temptation we face is to believe that better, more aggressive living can produce life for us. Okay? That if we can just do more and try harder, we can set ourselves free. We can make something of ourselves. If we can just put our mind to it, we can accomplish anything, and we can get for ourselves those things that matter most. So we imagine that real security is a financial category, and so we try to save ourselves by making money. Okay? Or we imagine that real peace is a social category, and so we try and save ourselves by becoming popular and reputable and influential. You know, Jim Carrey, one of the funniest guys on the planet, okay, said this, and he's actually a very thoughtful guy. Not a Christian, but more soberly aware of his condition. and the existential realities of life than a lot of Christians. And this is what he said recently. I wish everyone could experience being rich and famous so they would see that it isn't the answer for anything. It's amazing, coming from a guy who's rich and famous, okay? It's one thing for those of us who aren't rich and famous to say, rich and fame aren't the answer. Every time I say that, someone says, well, I would love to try and find out for myself. Jim Carrey says it. I wish everyone could become rich and famous so that they would be able to see for themselves it isn't the answer for anything. Most people in our world are trying to find life and peace and salvation and rescue and love in these ways. If they can just accomplish this, if they can just accomplish that, if they can just establish themselves in this way. And maybe it's not, fame or riches. Maybe it's if I can just be a good mother or a good father or a good husband or a good wife, if I can just be a good citizen, if I can just be this, that, or the other, then I will finally find the peace and the life and the love and the freedom and the rescue that I long for. Or we imagine that love comes our way when we are worthy of it. And so we work out, we diet, we try to make good first impressions, we hide our flaws and we hide our failures. I don't recommend that you watch a whole lot of Chris Rock stand-up comedy, but once in a while, okay, he can be a really, really funny dude. And I was watching a clip from him the other day, and it was just really funny. It was so true, okay? He says, no one ever meets us when they meet us for the first time. They meet our representative, okay? I mean, when you meet someone for the first time, when someone meets you for the first time, they're not meeting you, he says. They're meeting your representative. Why? Because he says, we all know that no one will love me for me, I mean, so we have to put on a front. We have to establish an image. We have to put our representative out front. We have to hide our flaws and our failures. We have to hide our faults. We can't show them who we really are, because if we showed them who we really are, we would not be loved. We would be alone, okay? Or we imagine that we can find true happiness and meaning in life if our marriage is strong and our kids turn out okay. And then our marriage gets rocky. Or our kids spin out of control and we despair. Okay, it feels like the flesh is being ripped off of our bones. Which is why I always go back to this question. I'm always asking this question to me: how is my present disappointment, discouragement, or grief a window on what has actually captured my heart? There's probably no better place to look if you want to find what it is your heart is really clinging to make life worth living than to investigate what is it that's grieving you? What is it that's discouraging you? What is it that's disappointing you? Because what that often reveals, what suffering and disappointment and grief often reveals, is what I'm really, really looking to make life worth living. And so we look, it's not that being a good husband and a good wife and raising good kids is a bad thing. It's a great thing. It's a beautiful thing, okay? And those of us who are husbands and wives and parents are striving for those things, or at least we ought to be striving for those things. But it's when we locate our identity, our worth, our value, when we think we can find peace and salvation and rescue and freedom in having a good marriage or raising good kids, that when marriage gets rocky or when kids spin out of control, we despair. Okay, I mean, this has happened to me. It's happened to me throughout the 18 years that I've been married and the 17 years that I've been a parent. You have a script. You have a script, and so much of that script is written according to what you think will ultimately establish you and bring you happiness and bring you peace and bring you joy. And we all have this script in various ways, and we develop this script, and then life happens, okay? You're married to a sinner, and you give birth to sinful children. And you're not in control of what everybody says and does. You're not in control. That's why I said, a number of weeks ago that I told someone, this was me at 25. I'm going to change the world, okay? This is me at 40. I can't change myself. I can't change my wife. I can't change my kids. Thank God for Jesus, okay? Wisdom comes with age, and reality too. And you have this sinful spouse, and you have sinful children, and lo and behold, they get off your script. And when you have located your security, and when you have determined to find life and love and peace and salvation and rescue and all of those things in these these things that can't give you what only Jesus can, when things begin to spin out of control or get off script, you despair, okay? When the job does not go according to plan. When you're 55 years old and you're remembering the dreams you had when you were 25 years old, and very few of those dreams have become a reality. When you expect to live till you're old, and then you get bad news from the doctor that there's a good chance you'll probably die young, okay? When you, like me, and I've shared this story before, when so much of your identity and worth and value is located in who you are as the son of established parents, and then after 41 years of marriage, those parents get divorced. All of those things that go off script cause you to go, what is it that I'm really looking to? What is it that I'm really, really depending on to make my life worth living? If you're a single woman and you want to get married and you've never been married, and from the time you were a little girl, your dream was, I want to get married and have kids. And you've never been married and you don't have kids. And that dream has died or is dying. Or you're a man and you've always hoped that you would do something great, that you would accomplish something of significance. And now you're getting older, that dream is dying. You could look across the board at just the wreckage of our lives, shattered dreams, things that we hoped would become a reality in our lives that just simply haven't happened. And we begin to despair, and as we despair, we begin to realize, and this is God bringing us to the end of our rope in order to set us free. We begin to realize that we were depending on these dreams, we were depending on these people, we were depending on accomplishing these things and becoming this particular way to save us. So we are, as I've said before, absolutely addicted to self-salvation projects and have been since Genesis chapter 3. And if you're a Christian, you're still addicted to self-salvation projects. I am too. Our hearts are idol-making factories, John Calvin said. We take the good things that God gives us, wife, husband, children, job, money, whatever, and we turn them into ultimate objects of worship, things that we lean on to make life worth living. And then when things begin to spin out of control or we lose something like that, we begin to question, what am I living for? We become depressed, we despair, we become sad, and it's there that we begin to wonder, what is it that we've really been depending on to make life worth living? And what we do is we wear ourselves out, okay? We absolutely wear ourselves out trying to accomplish the impossible, getting for ourselves all of the things that only God can give. All of these things, the things that matter, the things that your heart longs for, are things that only God can give you. They're not things that you can get for yourself. Peace and life and love and salvation and rescue and justification and all of those things. Those are only things that God can give you, and yet we wear ourselves out. Like Abraham and Sarah, we just don't believe the promise that all of these things come our way minus our merit, and that we no longer have to be triumphant achievers. All we have to be is a receiver of the gift. to be a receiver, to believe that the gift comes our way minus our merit, is the only thing that will set you and I free. And yet, because we don't believe the promise, this is just too good to be true. You kidding me? That's why I've said the law offends us because it tells us what to do, and none of us like being told what to do. Grace offends us even more because it tells us that there's nothing we can do, that it's all been done. And that's just too good to be true. I mean, that just sounds too good to be true. We fail like Abraham to believe the impossible promise, and so we seek to make the impossible possible by taking matters into our own hands, and we wear ourselves out trying to accomplish the impossible, trying to get for ourselves those things, those deep things that only God can give. I was at a conference in Atlanta 2 weeks ago, big leadership conference, and I was being interviewed before the conference with another leader, and the guy who was interviewing the two of us looked to me, first question, and said, as you interact with other leaders inside the church, as you interact with other people who are leading institutions or churches or whatever, what is the state of leadership in America today amongst Christians? And I don't know what kind of answer he was looking for, but my immediate response was, they're all tired. They're all worn out. When I think about leaders, specifically in the church, or when I think about people inside the church, one word comes to mind: burdened. They're tired. They're worn out. And the reason is because, like everyone else, we are desperately trying to accomplish the impossible. We're trying to achieve for ourselves those things that only God can give. And so we're tired. We take matters into our own hands and we try to make something of ourselves, and we put ourselves out there and we do everything we can to get what only God can give. Well, the truth is that the only hope we have for ourselves is to give up hope in ourselves. That's it. So, once you give up, you're free, all right? And I don't mean once you give up and sit on the couch and watch TV all day long. I'm not talking about apathy here, okay? I mean, once you give up trying to justify yourself, once you give up trying to get for yourself, slavishly trying to get for yourself those things that only God can give you, you're free. The way the New Testament puts it is, once you die, you live. And that's what it's talking about. Dying to all of your self-salvation projects, dying to all of your self-rescue efforts. Once you die, then you live. Now you're free. The chains have fallen off, and now you are free to invest your life without risk, because everything you need in Christ you have. So both Abraham and Sarah laugh. Abraham's laughter said, "This is impossible. Can't happen." Sarah's laughter said, "This is impossible. It did happen. God made it happen." The fact of the matter is, as I said, the only hope, the absolute only hope you and I have for ourselves is to absolutely, categorically give up hope in ourselves. It's the first confession of faith. I can't do it. Do you understand that this is what the Bible is about? Okay, I don't know what you think the Bible is about. Okay, timeless principles that if you apply, you can have a great life. Okay, I don't know what, we read it that way, okay? I read it that way, and I have to keep checking myself. The Bible's not about you, and it's not about me. The Bible is about what God in the person of Jesus has done to save wretches like you and me. That's what it is. And it's a theme that we keep going back to because the Bible keeps going back to it, because while we remain sinful, we need to be reminded of who God is and who we are. We need to be reminded over and over and over and over and over and over again that we can't do it. Because it's only the people who come to terms with the fact that they can't do it who then confess with the great freedom of laughter to say, he can, he did. That's when real rest happens. So the God who spoke into the darkness and said, let there be light, spoke into the deadness of Abraham and Sarah's childlessness and said, let there be life. Life-giving grace is always experienced in the face of hopeless impossibility. Always. God's grace becomes real for us in the context of catastrophe. I mean, that's the gospel. That God descended into our calamity, into our mess. God came down while we were at our worst and gave us his best. That's the gospel. When the waters were rising and the levees were breaking, God came. That's not only the story that we read in Genesis, it's also the story that we read when we see the entrance of Christ, John chapter 1, that the God who created all things took on human flesh and frailty and came. But it's also the way God entered your life and mine. I mean, that's my testimony. No one comes to faith in Christ. No one starts to believe in Jesus until they come to the end of themselves. That's the story of every real Christian. That God in some way brought me to the end of myself. I was brought to the end of myself. I was reminded of my limitations. I was faced with something impossible. And God came. When the waters were rising and the levees were breaking, God came. And in Jesus, this same life-giving God speaks into the death of our slavery and says, be free. He says to his enemies, you are my friend. He says to the desperate, you are delivered. He says to the lost, you are found. He says to the worn out, come to me. My burden is light. The reason you're tired is because you're trying to do for yourself what I have come to do for you. Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. I've already done everything. He says to the wounded, you are healed. He says to the dirty, you are clean. And he says to the tired worker, it is finished. That's what we read about in Genesis. It's what we read about throughout the Bible. It rings true in your heart and in mine. It's amazing to me how each week, and this happened with my son a couple weeks ago, but each week someone will come up to me at some point in time during the week after Sunday morning and say, you know, do you know did my wife talk to you? You know, did you follow me around? Do you know something about you? Did the pastor come? You know, did one of the other pastors come and tell you what I'm going through? Blah, blah. They kind of look paranoid, okay? My son said this to me the other week. I said, did you listen to the sermon? He said, yes. He goes, you were talking to me. Like, this whole sermon was crafted around me. He was serious. He wasn't saying like God was speaking to me through you. He was like, you were taking an opportunity from behind the pulpit to parent me, okay? And it's amazing to me. The reason that people from all walks of life can say that is because all of us are different, but we're basically all the same, okay? I mean, when I say these kinds of things, when God speaks these kinds of things to me and then to you through me on Sunday mornings, it resonates. It resonates with me. It resonates with our hearts because we go, yes, you've described life. You've described my life. You've described my struggle. Why? Because it's mine. Okay? I mean, this is my struggle. I mean, life is hard. And part of what makes life hard is we are tirelessly trying to do for ourselves what only Jesus can do. And so, to the tired worker, to the worn out, to the person who is desperately trying to save themselves, Jesus announces, it is finished. Rest. I have purchased rest for you. And that's good news. Good news that you need to hear, and good news that I need to hear week in and week out. Let's pray together.